So, over the past few months, I've made videos on different Beyblade Burst layer systems, and I've done all of them except dual layers. I feel like this is the hardest one to actually make a video on, which is why it took a while, but I figured the best way to do it would be to expand on the previous video, talking about the transparent plastic and how these layers are starting to kind of break through it. And once we get through that, I guess that'll be it for the whole sub-series, I guess you can call it. So there's going to be two subsections to this video. The first will be the dual layers that are evolutions to single layers. There were 14 of these, and I'll make direct comparisons to the previous version of the layer and then the new dual layer. The second are for the 11 bays that are completely original to the dual layer system. I'll still talk about these and how they work, but it might be a bit quicker, and in general, I'm not going to spend too much time on each bay here. I'll try to keep things moving, but anyway, let's go ahead and get into it. So first up we have Victory Valkyrie. Victory Valkyrie is a great example of how to evolve a single layer into a dual layer. There is no colored plastic breaking through the transparent plastic on the original Valkyrie. However, it does clearly have three main contact points. So for the dual layer, well, make all three of those break out. Works pretty well, and that's all there is to it. Yeah, like I said, I'm gonna try and keep this moving. Next is Storm Spriggan. Spriggan did have these two kind of diamond shapes poking out. Having those to be the areas to actually break out of the transparent plastic on Storm Spriggan makes sense. And you can also see kind of these diamond engravings here. So it works, it's fairly simple. Interestingly, they also did add more colored plastic underneath there, opposed to the original. Not really sure why, but I always liked how that looked. For Rising Ragnarok, it's a very similar situation to Valkyrie. Ragnarok had nothing poking through, so for Rising Ragnarok, just make the kind of main contact points poke through. And I guess there's a bit of extra plastic in the center here, so that works. Now, Kaiser Kirbyus is a very unique one, as I guess you sort of had like a chain kind of pattern on Kirbyus here. It's pretty vague though. So on Kaiser Kirbyus, they did something a bit different. Instead of kind of layering the different plastics into themselves, they kind of segmented a bit more. On the top you still have the transparent plastic, as it always was, but it's now segmented. And that's because underneath you have this chain design, which is honestly a really cool concept. I like how they did this one. It's definitely different than the others, but it works really well with the motif. Dark Death Scyther is pretty straightforward. There's a lot of extra plastic on the right side here, with the left side being almost entirely transparent. So we mimic that here on the dual layer, and there's pretty much like no transparent plastic on this side. It is entirely just exposed. Plays into the theme well, evolves it effectively. Looking at Wild Wyvern, it's very similar to some of the other ones. Wyvern did have some parts actually breaking through here, especially on this like top and bottom section. So for Wild Wyvern, well, mimic that. We keep these sort of sections here with plastic breaking out, and then you just make these two parts much bigger. It's fairly consistent with everything else. Obelisk Odin is a somewhat weird case. You had these two shuriken-like designs on Odin, and that is mimicked here on Obelisk Odin. But as for the parts actually breaking through the plastic beyond that, well, now we have these like sword kind of designs. They weren't really apparent on Odin, but I guess it kind of keeps with this whole weaponry theme with the whole shuriken stuff. It works, it's kind of cool, makes for a good design. A fairly unique approach, but definitely a good one. Holy Horror Suit's very awkward. Horror Suit didn't have anything breaking out of the transparent plastic, but for Holy Horror Suit they kind of just remodeled the entire structure of the layer, it feels. And then these kind of parts here just feel like a smaller reference to the original, and they added these entire like new upper and lower sections which are all broken out of the transparent plastic, which I guess makes sense in the context of an evolution. But yeah, it is sort of a weird shift. For Mad Metaboros, well, Metaboros was kind of one-sided here with this bottom part. So for Mad Metaboros, you just kind of have some of these parts here breaking out, and of course, on the very bottom at the main point here, that is entirely out as well, with there just being kind of standard transparent plastic up here. This follows the same kind of design philosophy as some of the others. Next up is Unlike Unicorn. This is another structurally different one, as the original Unicorn had this kind of mirrored design going on. Unlike Unicorn just has the main kind of unicorn motif there, and how they chose to advance it, well, first up you have this U here, which is a horseshoe as well. You can see that these are present on the original here, so breaking that out I think for the motif does make sense. And of course the other part being this horn here. The horns on the original had a bit of paint there, so putting more emphasis on that, especially now there's just one, does make a lot of sense. I'd argue it's a very similar design philosophy to the others. It's just that the structure of the layer is a fair bit different. Xeno Excalibur looks a lot different at first, but the more you look at it, it's actually not as different compared to what you might think. So Excalibur is already an absolutely insane design. Not only was the gold plastic already breaking out of the translucent red plastic, but instead of having this kind of window up front here in the center, you had an X. Now, Xeno Excalibur does kind of build on it with the X here, instead of having that kind of window with the letter engraved in there. It's just a big X. That works. Aside from that, you just have a bit of extra plastic coming out from the underneath, with the blue plastic surrounding it. That works. The main difference here is, of course, the sword being gold. It's a third color on the layer. It looks crazy. But in reality, this gold here is actually just paint. The real plastic is actually the same translucent blue as you would see on these sides here underneath. So when you look at it like that, it's actually very, very similar to this sword here on Excalibur. So it's not much different, but it was already crazy to begin with, so I think it just follows a very similar design philosophy to the others. It's just that Excalibur itself is already so advanced that Xeno doesn't need to do as much. But adding the paint does mask that pretty well. Exceed Evil Eye is another very structurally different layer. On Evil Eye, you can actually see these little 3 marks here sticking out of the transparent plastic. And they do have sort of a similar design to these points on Exceed Evil Eye, though I wouldn't have expected them to turn into the contact points that they did. But again, it works. It's very different, but the design philosophy is there and does follow a fairly consistent pattern. Nova Neptune is also pretty different structurally. The wave pattern of Neptune is pretty highly changed on Nova Neptune to be a lot more dynamic feeling, but beyond that, now that it's more 3-sided rather than 6-sided, you just put a bit of extra emphasis on the 3 sides. And again, fairly standard design philosophy for these dual layer evolutions. And to finish off our evolutions, we have Jaeger Yggdrasil. Well, obviously the color was greatly changed, but beyond that, the design itself is fairly similar. I mean, the shape's different, but that's not really uncommon for some of these bays. But again, you mainly just put emphasis on these main contact points, allow the green plastic to break out of the transparent plastic. It's reasonably consistent with everything else. The only other thing I have to add here is that these yellow markings are now gold markings on Jaeger and also proper Ys, which reflects well on the motif itself. It is another one that is fairly consistent with everything else. So the evolutions are very, very similar in how they conduct themselves. There are a few odd cases, of course. I think Kaiser Herbius and Holy Horus are good examples of this. But beyond that, it's mainly just take the main points of the layer and let those break out of the transparent plastic. It makes a lot of sense. It's a perfectly understandable way to make these, but I thought it was worth pointing out. However, we still have 11 more bays to go. These are all of the non-evolutions, the bays that start here in the dual layer system. So aside from just evolutions, so far with dual layers we have established that they mainly tend to emphasize the main contact points. So is this carried over properly to the other dual layers? Well, let's take a look at it. Starting us off, we have Baldur, our weird rare bay get battle bay. And despite the oddity of it, yeah, it does follow the main design philosophy as the others. You have these 5 main contact points, and yep, the gold plastic is breaking out of the transparent plastic. I guess it's also worth pointing out that you have these 5 screws here. They're painted. That does add to the design. But as a dual layer, it is pretty normal. Well, I guess aside from the actual center here, while it is raised a bit like the other dual layers, it's smaller than normal and doesn't have a letter. I guess that's worth pointing out. Zillion Zeus is a unique one to talk about. So you do have this plastic here kind of breaking out of the main points on each side. However, on the sides here, well, there's a lot of black plastic. I mean, really the contact points just going around the entire bay here are all the colored plastic. It's the solid plastic, not the translucent plastic. And yeah, rather than just having proper transparent plastic, it does have this kind of dark gray translucent plastic, which is fairly notable. So it does feel like a dual layer that is evolved a bit more than normal. But also, it was the first ever layer in Beyblade Burst to actually have a gimmick. Zillion Zeus, of course, has the 2 metal balls here in the layer, which, yeah, that's the first ever burst gimmick on a layer. So this one is definitely another outlayer, and a very cool one at that. Quadquetzalcoatl is also a pretty notable one in this regard. There really isn't a whole lot of transparent plastic on this thing. Like, I guess you have this small part up here and then the part down here, which I guess are contact points. But yeah, there's just a lot of colored plastic here that doesn't have anything covering it. This one is very much broken out compared to the others. Fang Fenrir does dial things back a bit. You have these 2 main points that are sticking out, with these other 2 points here just being the standard transparent plastic. It's nothing too unusual. Beast Behemoth is actually another very unusual one. This one actually being a bit closer to Kaiser Kirbius, as the transparent plastic doesn't really match with the opaque plastic. And to see this, I'll probably actually have to take this thing apart. So you can see the kind of 5 clear points here on the transparent plastic, but when you flip it over, well, it looks like this. It's nothing like the top part. So yeah, it's another very, very disconnected part, which does make it quite unique compared to a lot of the others. Oh, and you have a little bit of plastic breaking out in the center here, but that's not as notable. Inferno effort is pretty normal. You have a bit of extra plastic going around here in the center. However, it's the main 3 contact points that have the plastic sticking out. That's what we've come to expect. Psychic Phantom is the same exact way. It's the 2 main points here like that. Very standard. But then we get to Lost Longinus. This thing's kind of insane. So in terms of the actual dual layer plastic stuff, it's actually pretty traditional. It's really just this point and this point here, the 2 main contact points that have the opaque plastic sticking out. However, it's the metal up here that makes a big difference. This is technically the second ever gimmick we had, I guess if you want to count metal as a gimmick, but regardless, we've never had a bay like this where the layer has a ton of metal. It's the first of its kind, so dual layers are starting to be a bit more interesting to this point. This of course does take us to Beyblade Burst God, which is actually the first of these layer discussions I did, and that would tie into the gimmicks and stuff. But yeah, that's kind of where we got the roots from. But beyond that, as a dual layer again, the actual difference in plastic is fairly traditional. Giga Guy is a bit weird, because you'd expect these 2 points to be like the main points, but instead you have these like 4 blocky points on each side that are the ones that are broken out. I guess you'd argue it's kind of inverted to normal, but I guess you'd also argue that these are supposed to be the main points, so I don't know. It's not too unusual either way. Yeah, the Ormington is pretty standard. You have these 2 main points here. While they are pretty big, that's just where the opaque plastic comes out at, so fairly standard. And finally, Acid Anubis. Acid Anubis doesn't really have that much transparent plastic on it compared to most others. It does have it, of course, in the center here, but beyond that, it really only extends out at a few points here. You could argue that's just the nature of how the layer works, but these parts are like really exposed. And aside from that, they're not just gold, they also have these like blue stripes just built into the layer. So yeah, by this point, dual layers are definitely starting to evolve to a pretty decent point, and then of course after this we get to Beyblade Burst God, where, well, things advance a lot, and that's where we get the kind of gimmick focus. And again, that would then tie back to the first of these sort of Beyblade Burst layer discussions that I did. But yeah, that's really all for each one. So for these 11 bays that were natively dual layers, a lot of them do follow a somewhat similar design philosophy to the other dual layers that came before it, but we were definitely starting to see some more experimentation with these, and also a couple of them even had gimmicks that would be integral to the rest of Beyblade Burst. Alright, there's my half out of focus, half in focus final shot, but anyway, hopefully that video was at least somewhat interesting. Like I said, dual layers were like the weirdest line for me to cover. Gimmicks were pretty easy for everything else. Single layers I think at least had somewhat of a decent narrative. Dual layers were a bit odd, but I think just building off that video is probably the best way to go. So again, hopefully that worked out. We'll see. I mean, I still have to edit the video and see how it turned out, but yeah, that's everything for the kind of burst layer sub-series of discussions. Maybe at some point I'll talk about discs and drivers. That's going to be quite a while though, and I have to think about how I want to go about it, but I'll definitely think about it. But anyways, that's all for this video, so thanks for watching, and bye-bye.